As we did before, when we talked about the consumer's choice between consumption and leisure, what we have done is we have started with looking at the individual's problem or the individual's decisions. We then make the simplifying assumption that you have a representative consumer, say, and then that allows us to aggregate and look at equilibrium determination of prices and quantities. So remember that in this context, in the context of this model, what we're going to determine is the equilibrium real interest rate, which then allows us to determine what the equilibrium amount of current consumption is versus future consumption. And of course, along the way, what savings is. Now, let's assume that there are n of these identical consumers. We're now going to use capital letters to denote the aggregate quantities. And so, because we have a representative consumer, to get to the aggregate current consumption, we just take the individual's current consumption and multiply by n. Same thing for future consumption, same thing for total income. So this is going to be GDP in the economy as a whole, whereas this is an individual's income. And future income, now we have aggregate taxes today, aggregate taxes in the future, and we have aggregate savings. So SP is private sector savings. And it's going to be important to distinguish what's being saved by the private sector versus what's being saved or dissaved by the government. Now, the government, like consumers, has a budget constraint today and a budget constraint in the future. But now, as opposed to what we did before what we did was we forced the government to balance its budget, which meant G was always equal to T. But now, because this economy lasts more than one period, the government has the possibility of borrowing. So if government spending exceeds taxes, then the government can sell debt. Now, again, remember, everything here is in units of goods. But if they sell debt, then in the future, they're going to have to pay off that debt by the amount 1 plus R. And so future taxes are going to have to offset this increase in expenditures due to borrowing. Now, the government could be a borrower or a lender. So if B is positive, then it's a net borrower. If it's negative, then they're a net lender. And we're going to assume, because it's more consistent with reality, that the government is a net borrower. As with the individual, we can combine these two budget constraints by just substituting for B, and we get the government's present value constraint, which says that the present value of spending, that is current spending, purchases of goods, plus the present value of future purchases of goods, has to equal current taxes plus the present value of future taxes. The fact that this is a present value relationship as opposed to something that has to hold every single period, meaning G equals T all the time, is going to be very important for what we're going to do in the future. Okay, so the government's constraint today is simply that spending equals taxes plus the amount of revenue generated by selling debt or by borrowing. One thing that's going to be important to realize is because this economy only lasts 2 periods, the government can't borrow anything new in the second period. In the second period, they're going to have to pay off their debt plus finance whatever they're spending. And that means that they're not going to be able to do any borrowing in the second period. And this, of course, is just the analog to the private individual who is not going to do any saving in the second period,